Hello and welcome to a review of the Allyn and Bacon Guide to Writing Chapter 2. Let's first consider a general quote here, just to ponder. When I say, the good man gave his good dog a good meal, I use good analogically, and there is at the same time a similarity and a difference between a good man, a good dog, and a good meal. All three are desirable, but a good man is wise and moral, a good dog is tame and affectionate, and a good meal is tasty and nourishing. But a good man is not tasty and nourishing, except to a cannibal. And a good dog is not wise and moral, except in cartoons. And a good meal is not tame and affectionate, unless it's alive as you eat it. In this quote, as we open it up, it gets us to think about rhetoric. Rhetoric is how writers think about what is unknown or puzzling or controversial in their subject matter, and how their view of the subject might be different from their audiences. As we go through this section considering rhetoric, we need to consider the differences in terminology and intention. So let's look at how we can form a question within a bit of analogy. Appropriate language choice is a critical component of effective writing, but the language must highlight a consistent path for the reader to follow. And let's think about writing like climbing a mountain. If you start by stating, I'm going to climb a mountain, then there's an immediate need for clarification. Well, we start thinking, well, what mountain? And when will you start climbing? And how will you get there? Just like with worthwhile writing, we're starting with open-ended, unclear, ambiguous questions. And those questions are answered with a clear, developed thesis. When we take a look at this example, we recognize that the ambiguity and the lack of clarity is what actually creates an interest to our writing. And as we go through and we answer the lack of clarity and we start to determine what specifics we want to discuss, that's where the interest really comes in. So the thesis is like the ultimatum of the writing, not the beginning, just as reaching the top of the mountain is the conclusion of a goal, rather than the process of actually traversing the mountain. It's not about the answer, but the journey of a well-supported argument and acknowledgement of alternative views. And that's what's really bringing our writing to life. So as we go through this chapter, we want to consider the importance of word choice, forming our question, and how to really break everything down. So let's look at a few points about how we can really make our topics more complex. In Chapter 2 in the Allyn and Bacon Guide, we refer to wallowing in complexity. So we want to start with, well, what exactly does wallowing mean? Well, it's literally meaning to flounder around or to move about or to proceed clumsily or with difficulty, which I know doesn't exactly sound like something worthwhile, but by going through this process, we're ultimately able to show that we've really thought through arguments, we're able to create well-supported arguments. And that's really what college professors are expecting. They're expecting their students to wrestle with the problems by applying concepts and data, thought processes they learn in new situations. So it's not just about feeding back information, but actually processing it in a new way. We also want to keep in mind that we're learning to study the problem, and we have to look at many solutions. Oftentimes the initial solution is not the best solution, and it can oftentimes be more difficult to actually make a persuasive argument. So as we're going through and really learning about how to develop the arguments, we want to stay open about the answers to those questions before deciding on the best course of action. We essentially need to make sure that we're getting the right amount of thought behind the process. So some of the key skills for wallowing in complexity help us to really bring everything together. So let's consider a few of the qualities. Well, wallowing in complexity includes a range of skills that all need to be evident and they all need to complement each other throughout writing. The first big skill is posing problems, and this means asking open-ended, ambiguous questions that are likely to have really surprising answers. The second key is to analyze dimensions, which means we're considering key terms, it means we're thinking about the relevancy of the topic, and it means that we're thinking about the problems that the topic could potentially create. We'll see that ideas like free writing and idea mapping, dialectic talk, and playing in the believing and doubting games are some great strategies to generate and discover new ideas. As we move into our third big skill, we have gathering and interpreting support, which means considering the source of our information and also how relevant those materials are to what we're actually trying to do. As we move into the fourth example, we have addressing alternative solutions, which requires us to look at multiple perspectives, such as the author, critics, content experts, consumers, advocates, and more, depending on exactly what the scope of the writing is. It's very easy to sometimes get stuck in the author's view, and we have to keep in mind that there's more than just what the author's thinking. And in the case that there are multiple solutions, selecting the best solution takes the writing from a flat statement to a more complex argument. The fifth skill for wallowing complexity is justifying the conclusion. This illustrates that we're not just supporting our argument, but also reasons against the counter-arguments. For the reader, we've now not only acknowledged alternative solutions, but you're able to show that you have fully thought out the implications behind your selection. So to help us with some of these topics, we're going to start with a little exercise with some free writing. So for the next 10 minutes, I want you to try writing non-stop. During this exercise, do not edit yourself. Don't worry about proofreading. Don't worry about the flow. Don't worry about the structure. The purpose of free writing is to just get your ideas out. And if at any point during this exercise you get stuck, just keep writing something. Even if all you're writing is, I don't know what to write, that's fine. So, our actual prompt is going to be, what is the dumbest purchase you have ever made? Go ahead and set a timer for 10 minutes and write about the dumbest purchase you've ever made. This is a critical thinking exercise for learning about how to get your ideas out. So take a moment now, pause the video, and complete this assignment. I'll see you back shortly. Okay, welcome back. Take a look back over your free writing exercise and notice any patterns that you have in your writing. Notice if you went off on a particular tangent or focus. Perhaps you ended somewhere completely different than where you started. And that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's what free writing helps us do. It helps us get that thought process going, and there's nothing wrong with any of the concepts that you have in the free writing. You'll then be able to take this information and get into the gathering and supporting information stage to really break it down. Now, in addition to free writing, there's a few other types of exploratory writing. So if we take a look at some of these, focused free writing is very similar to the exercise that we just did, except we're looking at a very specific issue to deepen our thought process. And this is helpful if you're either given a very specific prompt or if you've already completed some preliminary brainstorming and need some more support. Another type of example is idea mapping. And idea mapping does not tend to really develop the ideas quite as much as the free writing does, but what it does help is to generate more ideas and to create a structural framework indicating which subject topics have more specifics. So what you can do for idea mapping is, in addition to doing some general pencil and paper writing, there are a number of free apps that you can get to through the Google Drive, or you can also check out the Android or the iTunes store. You can also just generally search the internet for mind mapping. And in fact, we're going to take a look at an exercise now where I have a recommended website for you to actually go to and check out some mind mapping tools. So what you'll do is you'll pause this video again, go through, review this website. You certainly don't have to check out all 25 tools that are recommended, but take a perusal through and determine which ones might fit you best. Once you're done looking through some of these tools, turn to pages 34 to 36 in your book and complete the second exercise towards the very bottom of the page. It's titled Generating Questions Using Idea Mapping and Discussion. Once you're done with this exercise, you'll then want to go onto your Blackboard account and click on the assignments link on the left. In the assignments link, you'll see a section to discuss your idea mapping exercise. In addition to actually answering the questions in the prompt for number 2, please feel free to also discuss anything that you found out about the mind mapping tools, in addition to those specific strategies. So again, please pause this video and go ahead and complete this exercise. Now that you've had the opportunity to compare and contrast free writing and idea mapping, let's take a look at just 2 more examples of exploratory writing techniques. So the next one that we have is dialectic talk, and this involves careful listening and purposeful, organized discussion about a topic. Discussing concepts with others allows you to work out and analyze different assumptions and contradictions in your thought process. Keep in mind that the goal of the dialectic talk is not to prove a point or to be right. Rather, the purpose of dialectic talk is to explore and evaluate, to grow and adapt your work to something that's more thorough and less questionable overall. In the dialectic talk, we're looking for ways to find potential pitfalls in your writing, and then that way you're able to address them. And a fourth example of exploratory writing is believing and doubting. So the believing and doubting game requires a little bit of additional explanation simply because it's a fairly difficult mental process for many students. So in order to completely do the believing and doubting game, the first thing that we want to do is imagine a possible answer to a problematic question. And once we've imagined some answer, whether or not it's the one that we believe, we're going to break it down. We're first going to make an argument saying that we do believe the answer, and then take the completely opposite stance by going and doubting it. So when we think about believing, this means that we're becoming sympathetic to an idea or point of view. Act as if you've fully embraced it and determine why that idea could really be beneficial and have such force behind it. When you do the opposite and you start doubting that example, be very judgmental and critical. What are some potential flaws that exist? What are some biases that come out in this overall argument? This particular exercise can be very difficult because oftentimes we want to stick to one point of view or another, but really making yourself completely think through both sides thoroughly without necessarily choosing which one's better helps you start to recognize key areas to really develop that complex writing style. Now that we've had the opportunity to consider the information about the believing and doubting game, let's complete an exercise. Complete part 1 of the exercise on page 48 to 49. For the first 10 minutes, you're going to believe one of the particular topics on page 49 or your own topic. Write as much as you can supporting that subject. Once you're done with those 10 minutes, take another 10 minutes and take the exact opposite side, doubting as much as you possibly can about that same subject. Once you've completed these 2 10-minute rounds of brainstorming, take some time and create a reflective paragraph, which is part 2 of the same assignment. You'll need to take your reflective paragraph and post it under the assignments link on Blackboard in the appropriate section. Make sure that your reflection takes into account all 3 bullet points on page 49. And then once your response is posted, also respond to at least 2 other classmates. Up until this point, we've really focused on the questions and also how to come up with some of our ideas. It's important to remember that once we have our ideas put together and we're creating a thesis, in order to make a really strong thesis, it needs to have a level of surprise with it. There needs to be an element of uncertainty or risk or a challenge, particularly to the reader. And it's really going to be beneficial if the reader is surprised by something, if there's something unexpected or different, something that's actually challenging the way that the reader is going into the overall argument. Essentially, surprise is bringing some sort of new aspect to the reader. And it's really a measure of how change in an essay is coming about in the reader. So the more that we're able to take a reader from one perspective and persuade them of another perspective, the more that we know that our writing is going to be effective. And there's essentially 2 primary ways that we can create a surprising thesis. So one is to go straight about trying to change the reader's view. And the second is to create a level of tension in our overall writing. So when we go and we look at how to change our reader's point of view, in order to effectively do this, we have to consider where our reader is starting from. So we must identify, well, what exactly are my reader's current ideas? Does my reader agree with this topic, not agree with this topic? Does my reader like this topic or not like this topic? What currently interests my reader about these topics? And then we also have to brainstorm what we want that change to be. So after the essay, we need to consider what we want our end goal to be. So if the readers were thinking that perhaps they were supporting opinion X, well, now at the end of the essay, they might be considering that they're supporting opinion Y. Essentially what we're doing is we're creating new information for the reader to take in, and that's allowing them to change their actual perspective. Now, in terms of giving the thesis tension, here we're really bringing the reader into a section of unfamiliarity. We're creating some sort of surprising reversal. So whereas in the first example, we're saying this is what the reader already believes in creating tension, we tend to start with more generalities. We tend to say, okay, this is what most people believe, and really it's not a true statement. To get some additional examples, take a look at the questions on the bottom of page 38. Also, taking a good look at the table Strategies for Creating a Thesis with Tension or Surprise on pages 39 and 40 will give you some very specific examples. So now that we know a little bit about how to create these different thesis statements, let's give it some practice. What I'd like you to do for this exercise is to come up with 2 different thesis statements in response to the question, how can Del Tech best support its students? Now there's many different responses to this question. So you want to take at least 2 distinct points of view. And as you write these thesis statements, be sure to consider who your intended audience is, what their background is, what might surprise these audience members, and then also determine what kind of evidence you would actually need to support the thesis. Now, you do not need to write a full essay, but just thinking about it and what that thesis statement is and getting a general idea of what kind of evidence you would be using. Once you complete this exercise, go to the assignments link in Blackboard and post your responses with your thesis statements as well as your evaluations. The last section that we're going to talk about today has to do with good introductions. So in order to really have a solid introduction, we need to follow the checklist that's available for us on pages 42 to 45 of your text. Starting with the background, we need to understand what needs to be given to the reader to understand the topic area and provide the context. Are we talking to experts? Are we talking to people who have different kinds of views? Are we talking to people who are completely new to the topic? We also need to make sure that we have a good question built into our problem. We may or may not have the answer in the very beginning, which is fine, but we at least need to have some sort of idea, some sort of problem. And we also need to understand how that question is important. So, for example, we might not care why your favorite color is blue or red or whatever color it might be, unless you tell us. So maybe, for example, the reason your favorite color is blue is because you're colorblind, and now that can create all sorts of different ideas and concepts in terms of what's important and what's not. So as we go through these examples of the introductions, we want to remember that our thesis, though it might be a statement of some sort, it's based off of that question. And we need to create something, we need to explain where the problem's coming from. We also need to consider why it's worth examining. So just because you find something interesting doesn't mean the audience member will. And that's where you need to bring in some extra insight to them. This might mean asking some open-ended questions. This might mean posing an unfamiliar scenario and something that's creating that level of surprise very early on. And the writer's thesis should be somewhere in that introduction. Now, if we look at the difference between open prose and closed prose, we do know that open prose oftentimes doesn't have that thesis until towards the end. We should still have some sort of inkling of where the paper is going, simply because the audience does need to have that guidance and that structure. And to help you really build through these, be sure to review pages 44 to 45 of your text. The table Strategies for Introducing Your Problem to Targeted Readers helps to really condense the direct strategies for how to do this. So as a summary, there's 4 primary assignments that you're completing. The first is the free writing exercise. This is something that's not handed in, but it does help you get a really good idea for how to brainstorm, and it gives you some practical application. The second thing that you're completing is the idea mapping exercise. So you're reviewing different types of idea mapping, and then you're actually going in and doing some brainstorming and then discussing via the assignment section on Blackboard some reflections about your idea mapping. The believing and doubting game exercise requires you to, again, do some brainstorming, one side supporting an idea, the other side denying an idea, and then putting your reflection on Blackboard. In addition to putting your reflection for the believing and doubting game, be sure to also respond to at least 2 other posts. And lastly, for your thesis exercise, you're coming up with 2 different thesis statements and considering the different factors that cause those thesis statements to be different. Good luck with your assignments, and please let me know if you have any questions. Take care.